The night a father chose his mistress over his sick daughter was the night he lost far more than a family. The soft glow of midnight settled over St. Matthew Children's Hospital like a blanket of silver light, reflecting against polished floors and quiet windows overlooking the sleeping city beyond. In room 814, Brielle Carter sat perfectly still beside her 8-year-old daughter, Lila, her fingers gently wrapped around the little girl's hand as a heart monitor traced steady green lines across a screen. The room smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender lotion, a combination Brielle had come to associate with courage. Outside the door, nurses moved through the hallway in careful silence, their footsteps softened by the late hour. Inside, time seemed suspended. Lila's dark curls rested against a white pillow, and though exhaustion shadowed her young face, she still managed a small smile whenever she looked at her mother. "Mom," she whispered, her voice fragile but warm. "Daddy's coming, right?" Brielle felt the question settle heavily in her chest. She glanced at her phone again. 6 unanswered calls. 3 unread messages. Not a single response. She forced a smile and brushed a strand of hair from Lila's forehead. "Maybe he's caught in traffic, sweetheart." It was a gentle lie, and they both knew it. Hundreds of feet above Manhattan, crystal chandeliers illuminated the ballroom of the Whitmore Foundation Gala. Cameras flashed. Champagne sparkled. Wealth and influence mingled beneath ceilings painted with gold leaf and history. Everett Whitmore stood at the center of it all, dressed in an immaculate black tuxedo, every inch the successful millionaire admired by magazines and investors alike. Beside him stood Celeste Monroe, radiant beneath the lights, her hand resting possessively on his arm as reporters competed for attention. The image would appear perfect on tomorrow's society pages. What no photograph could capture was the empty hospital chair waiting for him across the city. Back in room 814, the clock crept past midnight. Brielle rose quietly and walked toward the window. Rain had begun to fall, tiny droplets tracing silver paths down the glass. She remembered another rainy night nearly 10 years earlier when Everett had promised that family would always come first. Back then he had looked at her as though she were the only person in the world. Somewhere along the way, ambition had become distraction, distraction had become distance, and distance had become absence. The transformation had happened so gradually that she had barely noticed until she found herself standing alone in hospital corridors while her husband smiled for cameras. Behind her, a machine emitted a soft warning tone. Brielle turned immediately, adjusting Lila's blanket before the nurse arrived. Her movements were calm, practiced, protective. She no longer waited for rescue. She had learned how to be strong in silence. As she settled back into the chair beside her daughter, her wedding ring caught the pale light from the window. For a moment, it shimmered like a memory from another life. Then Brielle looked down at Lila's sleeping face and understood something with perfect clarity. Tonight was not the beginning of her heartbreak. It was the beginning of her fight. The rain continued to whisper against the hospital windows as dawn slowly painted the Manhattan skyline in shades of silver and pale gold. Brielle had not slept. She sat beside Lila's bed, her fingers wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. Across the room, a small collection of drawings decorated the wall. Crayon castles, smiling suns, family portraits drawn by a little girl who still believed every broken thing could be fixed. One picture caught Brielle's attention more than the others. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands beneath a bright blue sky. Above them, written in careful handwriting, were the words "My Forever Family." Her chest tightened. There had been a time when those words felt true. 10 years earlier, Everett Whitmore had walked into her life carrying nothing but confidence, ambition, and a smile that made impossible dreams feel within reach. He had not cared that Brielle came from a modest neighborhood in Baltimore. He had not cared that she worked 2 jobs while finishing college. He only cared that she was kind, intelligent, and fearless. At least that was what he used to say. Their first apartment had been barely 700 square feet, with creaking floors and a view of a brick wall instead of a skyline. Yet Brielle remembered those years as the richest of her life. They ate takeout on the floor because they could not afford a dining table. They celebrated every small victory as though it were a national holiday. When Everett landed his first major investment deal, they danced in the kitchen until midnight. When Brielle earned her graduate degree, He filled their apartment with white roses and handwritten notes. They were partners. They were a team. Then success arrived. Slowly at first. A bigger office. A larger house. Exclusive events. Private flights. Endless meetings. The empire Everett dreamed about began to take shape, and with every new achievement, another piece of their simple life seemed to disappear. Brielle tried to convince herself it was temporary. Every ambitious season eventually ended. Every family made sacrifices. But the sacrifices never stopped. Everett missed birthdays because of conferences. He skipped anniversaries because of negotiations. He promised vacations that never happened. He always had a reason. Always another deal. Always another opportunity. Then came Celeste Monroe. Brielle had first heard her name 18 months earlier. A public relations consultant hired to improve the company's image. At first, she was simply another employee. Then she became a regular topic in conversation. Soon she was appearing in photographs beside Everett at charity events, business dinners, and award ceremonies. Brielle never accused. Never argued. She believed trust meant patience. But patience could not fill an empty chair at dinner. It could not explain unanswered messages. It could not comfort a little girl who stared out windows waiting for her father to come home. A soft movement pulled Brielle back to the present. Lila opened her eyes and offered a sleepy smile. "Mom," she whispered, "did Dad call?" Brielle looked at the silent phone resting beside her purse. For a moment she said nothing. Then she leaned forward and kissed her daughter's forehead. Outside, the city was waking up. Inside, something in Brielle was finally waking up too. By late afternoon, storm clouds had gathered over Manhattan once again, turning the glass towers of the city into mirrors of gray and silver. Inside St. Matthew Children's Hospital, the atmosphere had shifted. Doctors moved with greater urgency. Nurses exchanged careful glances. The quiet rhythm that had comforted Brielle through the night now carried an undercurrent of concern she could not ignore. Lila sat propped against her pillows, clutching a worn stuffed rabbit that had accompanied her through every hospital visit since she was 5 years old. She tried to be brave. She always did. But Brielle could see the fatigue hiding behind her daughter's smile. A gentle knock sounded at the door before Dr. Nathan Reynolds entered carrying a tablet and a folder. His expression was professional, but there was kindness in his eyes. Brielle immediately stood. Mothers learned to read faces long before words were spoken. "What is it?" she asked quietly. The doctor hesitated for only a moment. "We have reviewed the latest test results. We need to begin an additional treatment protocol as soon as possible." The words landed heavily in the room. Brielle listened carefully as he explained the procedure, the timeline, and the authorization required. Most of it blurred together beneath the growing sound of her own heartbeat. Only one fact remained crystal clear. Everett's signature was required for part of the approval process tied to their insurance and family trust arrangements. Brielle looked at her phone again. No messages. No missed calls. Nothing. Dr. Reynolds placed a reassuring hand over the folder. "Time matters here, Mrs. Whitmore." Brielle nodded. "I understand." The moment he left, she stepped into the hallway and dialed Everett again. The call rang several times before forwarding to voicemail. She called again and again. Each attempt ended the same way. The polished walls of the hospital corridor reflected her silhouette beneath the fluorescent lights. For the first time in years, she felt something beyond disappointment. She felt anger. Not loud anger. Not reckless anger. The kind that formed quietly after too many broken promises. Across town, cameras flashed beneath the grand entrance of the Metropolitan Heritage Center. Reporters crowded behind velvet ropes as business leaders arrived for a nationally televised charity event. Everett stood near the stage speaking with investors, while Celeste remained close beside him. The spotlight loved them. The headlines loved them. The illusion was flawless. Then Everett's phone vibrated again. He glanced down briefly. "Brielle." Another call. Celeste noticed immediately. "You should silence it," she said softly. "You have an important speech in 10 minutes. Everett stared at the screen. For a fraction of a second, uncertainty crossed his face. Then he pressed decline. The phone disappeared into his pocket. The moment passed. Back at the hospital, Brielle lowered her phone and stared through a nearby window overlooking the city. Tiny lights were beginning to appear as evening approached. Somewhere among them stood the man who had once promised to protect this family above all else. Somewhere among them, he had chosen something else. Behind her, Lila's small voice broke the silence. Mom. Brielle turned immediately. Yes, sweetheart. Lila offered a faint smile. You do not have to keep calling. I know you are here. Brielle felt tears threaten the edges of her composure, but she refused to let them fall. Instead, she crossed the room, sat beside her daughter, and wrapped her hand around the little girl's fingers. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the darkening sky. Inside, a decision was beginning to form. If Everett would not show up for his daughter when she needed him most, then Brielle would stop waiting for him to become the man he used to be. The following evening arrived wrapped in cold rain and city lights. The Metropolitan Heritage Center shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers and camera flashes as Manhattan's elite gathered for another celebration of wealth, influence, and carefully crafted appearances. Everett Whitmore stood near the center of the ballroom beneath a canopy of golden light, accepting congratulations from investors and reporters who praised his generosity, his leadership, and his vision for the future. Celeste Monroe remained beside him, elegant and composed, her smile perfectly rehearsed for every photograph. Around them, glasses sparkled, music drifted through the air, and conversations floated effortlessly from table to table. It was a world built on image, a world where uncomfortable truths rarely received an invitation. Then the ballroom doors opened. The movement was subtle at first. A few heads turned. A few conversations paused. Brielle Carter stepped inside wearing a simple navy dress and a long cream-colored coat still damp from the rain. She carried no anger on her face, no dramatic expression, no desire for attention. Her calm presence alone seemed to alter the atmosphere. Everett noticed her immediately. His smile faded. For a brief moment, the noise of the room seemed distant. Brielle walked forward with measured steps, passing beneath chandeliers that reflected against polished marble floors. She did not look at the reporters. She did not look at Celeste. Her eyes remained fixed on Everett. Several guests recognized her as his wife. Curious whispers began moving through the crowd like a gentle wave. Everett took a step forward. Brielle, he said quietly, what are you doing here? She stopped a few feet away. The distance between them felt larger than the ballroom itself. I called you 17 times, she replied. Her voice remained steady, controlled. I know. Everett glanced briefly toward nearby cameras. This is not the place. Brielle nodded slowly. You are right. The hospital was the place. The words landed with more force than any raised voice ever could. Celeste folded her arms and shifted uncomfortably. Several guests lowered their conversations entirely. Brielle reached into her purse and removed a small plastic hospital wristband. White, ordinary, barely noticeable beneath the ballroom lights. Yet somehow it seemed more powerful than every diamond in the room. She placed it gently on a nearby cocktail table between herself and Everett. The room became silent. Everett stared at the bracelet. Lila Whitmore. Patient identification. Admission date. The simple details seemed impossible to ignore. While you were standing here accepting applause, Brielle said softly, your daughter was asking whether her father would come. Everett swallowed hard. For the first time all evening, he had no prepared response. No strategy. No polished statement. Only silence. Brielle continued. She stopped asking this morning. Something shifted behind Everett's eyes. Not embarrassment. Not frustration. Something deeper. Something far more dangerous. Recognition. Brielle looked at the wristband one final time before lifting her gaze back to him. I did not come here to argue. I came because our daughter deserved better than another unanswered call. Then she turned toward the doors. No tears. No scene. No accusation. Only dignity. As she walked away beneath the golden lights, the ballroom remained frozen in silence. And for the first time in a very long time, Everett Whitmore felt the weight of everything he had chosen to ignore. The morning after the gala felt strangely quiet, as though the city itself were holding its breath. Rainwater still clung to the sidewalks outside St. Matthew Children's Hospital, while pale sunlight filtered through the clouds, casting soft reflections across the lobby floors. Brielle sat beside Lila's bed reading from her daughter's favorite storybook when her phone vibrated. The caller identification displayed an unfamiliar number. Normally she would have ignored it, but something urged her to answer. Mrs. Whitmore, a nervous voice asked. My name is Hannah Pierce. I worked in the accounting division at Whitmore Capital until last week. Brielle remained silent. There are things you should know. 20 minutes later, an email arrived containing documents, expense reports, reimbursement requests, and internal correspondence. Brielle opened the files one by one. The deeper she looked, the colder she felt. Luxury vacations disguised as corporate retreats. Personal purchases charged to company development budgets. Consulting fees paid to shell companies connected to Celeste Monroe. None of it was illegal on the surface, but together the pattern painted a troubling picture. The woman who had positioned herself as Everett's trusted advisor appeared far more interested in Whitmore Capital's resources than its future. Across town, Everett sat alone in his office overlooking Midtown Manhattan. The hospital wristband remained on his desk exactly where he had placed it after returning from the gala. Every time he tried to focus on quarterly reports, his eyes drifted back to the small white band bearing his daughter's name. He had barely slept. The memory of Brielle's calm voice echoed louder than any criticism ever could. A knock interrupted his thoughts. Celeste entered carrying coffee and a confident smile. "The media loved your speech last night," she said. "The coverage is already trending." Everett barely looked up. "I am not interested in the coverage." The response caught her off guard. "You have a board meeting in an hour. Cancel it." Celeste stared at him. "Everett, what is happening?" For a moment he said nothing. Then his computer screen illuminated with an incoming message from the company's compliance department. Attached were the same documents Brielle had received. Someone had filed an internal review request overnight. Everett opened the files. His expression darkened with every page. The room grew very still. Celeste's confidence began to crack. "Those reports are being misunderstood," she said quickly. "I can explain everything." Everett continued reading. Several transactions carried her authorization. Others contained signatures from individuals linked directly to her consulting network. Small amounts at first, then larger ones. Patterns impossible to ignore. "Explain what?" he asked quietly. Celeste stepped forward. "You know how corporate expenses work. People are trying to make me look guilty." Everett slowly raised his eyes. For the first time in months, he looked at her without admiration, without distraction, without illusion. He simply looked, and what he saw unsettled him. Not because of the numbers, not because of the investigation, but because he suddenly realized how little he truly knew the woman standing before him. Meanwhile, back at the hospital, Brielle closed her laptop and looked toward her sleeping daughter. The sunlight touched Lila's face, soft and warm against the white sheets. Brielle gently brushed a curl from her forehead and exhaled. She had spent too many years believing she was fighting another woman for her husband's attention. Now she understood the truth. Her battle had never been against Celeste. It had always been against the lies that allowed important things to be forgotten. And those lies were finally beginning to fall apart. 3 days later, the sky above Manhattan carried the pale blue color that often follows a storm. Sunlight reflected against glass towers, but inside the Whitmore family penthouse, the atmosphere felt strangely empty. Brielle stood in the master bedroom, surrounded by half-packed boxes. The room looked exactly as it always had. The designer furniture remained perfectly arranged. Family photographs still occupied polished shelves. Expensive artwork still decorated the walls. Yet something essential had already disappeared. Hope. For years she had convinced herself that patience could heal distance. She had believed that if she loved hard enough, waited long enough, and sacrificed quietly enough, her family would eventually find its way back together. Now she understood that some things only change when someone finds the courage to stop accepting what should never have become normal. She carefully folded one of Lila's sweaters and placed it into a suitcase. The soft lavender fabric still carried the scent of her daughter's favorite detergent. Nearby sat a framed photograph taken during a beach vacation years earlier. Everett was holding Lila on his shoulders while Brielle laughed beside them. Looking at the picture felt like staring through a window into another lifetime. Her phone buzzed. A message from her attorney confirmed that temporary custody paperwork and financial protections were already being processed. Brielle had spent the previous 48 hours meeting with legal advisors, hospital administrators, and financial planners. Not because she wanted revenge. Not because she wanted to destroy Everett. Because she wanted stability for her daughter. Because she could no longer build her future around promises that never arrived. Downstairs, the front door opened. Everett entered carrying a bouquet of white roses. The flowers had once been her favorite. He froze when he noticed the luggage near the staircase. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt heavier than any argument. "You are leaving," he finally said. Brielle nodded. "Yes." Everett glanced around the room as though seeing it for the first time. "Brielle, we need to talk. We have needed to talk for a very long time." Her voice remained calm. That calmness unsettled him more than anger ever could. "The investigation uncovered serious issues," Everett said. "Celeste has been removed from every company project. The board is conducting a full review." Brielle looked at him steadily. "That has nothing to do with why I am leaving." The words landed with painful precision. Everett lowered his eyes. For months he had blamed schedules, responsibilities, pressure, expectations. Then he blamed Celeste. But standing in front of packed suitcases and an empty future, he could no longer avoid the truth. The choices had been his. Every missed birthday, every unanswered call, every hospital visit he skipped, every moment his daughter waited by a window, those belonged to him alone. Across the city, Lila remained at St. Matthew Children's Hospital completing her latest treatment session. A volunteer had placed colorful paper stars across her room, each one carrying encouraging messages from nurses and staff. Brielle planned to bring her home to a new apartment overlooking Riverside Park, smaller than the penthouse, simpler than the life they once knew, but filled with something she valued far more than luxury: peace. Everett slowly placed the roses on a nearby table. The flowers looked beautiful beneath the afternoon light. Brielle barely glanced at them. Some gestures arrived too late. As she closed the final suitcase, she felt neither triumph nor bitterness, only clarity. And for the first time in many years, that clarity felt stronger than heartbreak. 2 weeks later, autumn sunlight poured through the tall windows of St. Matthew Children's Hospital, painting long ribbons of gold across the floor. The season was changing. So were the people inside it. Lila's condition had begun to stabilize, and for the first time in months, her laughter occasionally returned to the room. Small victories filled the days. A stronger appetite, a longer walk down the hallway, a smile that lasted a little longer than before. Brielle treasured every one of them. She had rented a modest apartment overlooking Riverside Park, and each evening she described it to Lila in vivid detail. The maple trees turning amber, the benches beside the river, the window in Lila's future bedroom that faced the morning sun. They spoke about tomorrow as though it were a destination they were slowly approaching together. Across the city, Everett Whitmore sat alone in his office long after sunset. The board investigation had consumed headlines for days. Celeste Monroe had disappeared from public view, and several questionable financial arrangements were under review. Yet none of it occupied his thoughts the way it once would have. The empire he spent years building suddenly felt quiet, hollow. The corner office overlooking Manhattan remained unchanged, but the man sitting inside it no longer felt the same. His desk contained only 3 personal items now: a photograph of Lila at 6 years old holding a science fair ribbon, a family picture from their beach vacation, and the hospital wristband. He stared at them often, sometimes for hours. One evening, he found himself driving toward the hospital without planning to. The city lights blurred beyond the windshield as rain drifted across the streets in soft silver lines. By the time he reached St. Matthew Children's Hospital, visiting hours had nearly ended. He walked through the familiar lobby carrying nothing in his hands. No flowers, no gifts, no grand gesture, only regret. When he reached Lila's room, he stopped. The door stood slightly open. Through the narrow gap, he could see his daughter sleeping peacefully beneath a pale blue blanket. A stuffed rabbit rested beside her. The paper stars still decorated the walls, and beside the bed sat an empty chair. Everett stared at it. That chair should have held him during countless nights, during doctor consultations, during difficult treatments, during moments when a frightened little girl simply needed her father nearby. Instead, it had remained empty. The realization settled heavily inside him. Money could fill boardrooms. Influence could shape headlines. Success could build towers that touched the clouds. But none of those things could travel backward and reclaim a missed moment. Brielle stepped quietly into the hallway behind him. For several seconds, neither spoke. Everett kept his eyes on the empty chair. "I should have been here," he said finally. The words emerged softly, stripped of pride and excuses. Brielle looked through the doorway toward their sleeping daughter. "Yes," she answered. Nothing more. No accusation. No lecture. Just the truth. Everett lowered his head. For the first time in years, there was no one else to blame. Not business. Not pressure. Not Celeste. Only himself. And standing there beneath the soft hospital lights, staring at the empty chair beside his daughter, Everett understood that losing Brielle had hurt. But realizing the father he had failed to become hurt far more. Winter arrived gently that year. The trees along Riverside Park stood bare against pale skies, and the Hudson reflected ribbons of silver beneath the afternoon sun. Nearly 3 months had passed since Brielle and Lila moved into their new apartment. It was not a penthouse overlooking the city skyline. It was not featured in magazines or admired by investors. Yet every room felt warm, real, alive. Lila's health continued to improve with each passing week. Her treatments were working. Her strength was returning. The walls of her bedroom were covered with drawings, photographs, and colorful paper stars she had brought home from the hospital. Every morning she sat beside the window wrapped in a blanket, watching runners pass through the park below while planning all the things she wanted to do once she was fully healthy again. Brielle often stood quietly in the doorway listening to her daughter dream about the future. Those moments felt priceless. Across Manhattan, Whitmore Capital faced difficult months. Internal reviews had confirmed extensive misuse of company resources tied to Celeste's network of consultants. The board removed several executives connected to the scheme, and legal teams spent countless hours repairing damage that had spread far beyond financial reports. Celeste's carefully constructed image collapsed almost overnight. Invitations disappeared. Contracts vanished. The attention she once chased turned away just as quickly as it had arrived. Everett watched it all unfold with a strange sense of detachment. For years he had believed success meant protecting appearances. Now he understood that appearances were often the first thing to disappear when truth entered the room. One snowy afternoon, Everett arrived at Riverside Family Court. Large windows overlooked the city while attorneys reviewed final documents regarding custody arrangements and family protections. There was no dramatic confrontation, no public spectacle, only signatures, quiet conversations, and decisions focused on what mattered most. Brielle sat across the table composed and steady. Months earlier, she might have entered the room carrying disappointment. Today she carried confidence. She had spent every day fighting for stability, medical support, and a future centered around Lila's well-being. The outcome reflected that effort. Primary custody remained with Brielle. Financial safeguards for Lila's treatment and education were formally established. Everett agreed to every condition without argument. The court proceedings ended in less than an hour. When everyone began gathering their documents, Everett remained seated. "Thank you," he said quietly. Brielle looked up. "For what?" He hesitated. "For never allowing my mistakes to become her burden." Brielle considered the words. Through the window behind him, snow drifted softly above the city streets. "Lila deserves parents who put her first," she answered. That was always the point. Later that evening, Brielle and Lila walked through Riverside Park beneath strings of holiday lights. The air was cold enough to turn their breath into tiny clouds. Lila laughed as snowflakes landed on her coat sleeves. Nearby, families gathered around food carts and decorated trees. Life moved forward. Simple, beautiful, honest. For the first time in years, Brielle felt no need to prove anything. She had not won because Everett lost. She had not succeeded because someone else fell. She had simply chosen her daughter, again and again, until that choice transformed their future. And beneath the glow of winter lights, surrounded by quiet joy, that future finally felt secure. 1 year later, spring returned to Manhattan in a cascade of color and light. Cherry blossoms lined the paths of Riverside Park, their pale petals drifting through the air like quiet reminders that even the harshest winters eventually surrender to new beginnings. The city looked different to Brielle now, not because the buildings had changed, but because she had. She stood beneath a white canopy outside the newly opened Lila Hope Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families navigate medical crises without feeling alone. Volunteers moved between tables decorated with flowers and handwritten notes from children whose lives had been touched by the foundation's work. Laughter filled the air. Hope filled the space between strangers. And at the center of it all stood Brielle, graceful and confident, no longer defined by the pain she had survived, but by the purpose she had built from it. Nearby, 12-year-old Lila greeted guests with the bright smile that doctors once feared they might never see again. Her health had improved dramatically over the past year. Strength had returned to her voice, her laughter, and her dreams. She moved through the crowd with the easy confidence of someone who understood how precious life could be. Watching her felt like watching sunlight after a storm. As the afternoon continued, Brielle stepped onto a small stage to thank supporters. The breeze carried the scent of fresh flowers across the gathering while hundreds of faces listened. She spoke about resilience, about community, about the quiet power of showing up when someone needs you. She never mentioned heartbreak. She never mentioned betrayal. Some chapters no longer required retelling. When the applause faded, her eyes drifted toward the back of the crowd. There, standing beneath a blooming cherry tree, was Everett Whitmore. He wore a simple navy suit without cameras, reporters, or business associates surrounding him. Time had changed him as well. The sharp edges of ambition had softened. Humility had settled where certainty once lived. He had spent the past year rebuilding more than a company. He had spent it rebuilding trust with his daughter one small moment at a time. School events, weekend visits, hospital follow-ups. No headlines announced those efforts. No audience applauded them. Yet they mattered more than any business achievement he had ever earned. After the event ended, Brielle found him standing alone near the river. The afternoon sun reflected across the water, turning it into a ribbon of gold. For a moment neither spoke. Then Everett smiled gently. "You built something beautiful," he said. Brielle looked back, toward the foundation bearing her daughter's name. Volunteers were cleaning up. Children were laughing. Lila was helping stack chairs while telling a story that made everyone around her smile. "We built it," Brielle replied softly. Everett nodded. He understood what she meant. The road that led here had been painful, imperfect, yet somehow it had brought them to a place where healing could exist without forgetting the lessons that created it. "Thank you," he said, "for giving me the chance to become a better father." Brielle looked at him for a long moment before offering a small smile filled with grace rather than bitterness. "That choice was always yours." The breeze carried cherry blossoms across the riverbank as they stood in comfortable silence. Some love stories end with reunions. Others end with revenge. This one ended with something rarer: growth, forgiveness, dignity. And as the golden light of evening settled over the city, Brielle watched her daughter laughing among friends and realized that justice had never been about making someone suffer. It had always been about protecting what mattered most and having the courage to rise when life asked everything of you. The game had changed long ago, and now, at last, she was writing the rules.